Good morning. The title of my conference is The Difference Between Aquinas and Kant in the Approach to Human Understanding. This title may look like saying the difference between apples and oranges. Did we need a paper on that? Kant and Aquinas. Who can doubt they are different? And however, there are some who equate Aquinas and Kant in doctrines in which they are actually opposed. Some attribute to Saint Thomas Aquinas approaches that are Kantian and by no means Thomistic. They make those mistakes by misinterpreting or misusing Aquinas' texts. Just two examples. Aquinas says, the intellect in act and the thing understood in act are the same thing. Intellectum in actu est intellectus in actu. And from here, some conclude that the act of understanding is the very act of the object known. That is to say, they identify the act by which the thing is in reality, the act of being, with the act of understanding it, which is the act of knowing. As if the thing understood, as understood, had no other being in itself than the being it has in its mind. Aquinas also says that the agent intellect makes intelligible the particular reality. And from here, some want to conclude that for Aquinas, the universal content in human understanding does not come from the things themselves. Instead, the things themselves, which are sensible, and therefore, they say, have no intelligibility whatsoever, the things themselves are made intelligible by the agent intellect, by our spirit. In other words, the doctrine of the agent intellect is for them a confirmation that, for Aquinas, universality, intelligibility, and necessity in the object of human understanding are the result of the activity of the intellect. As for Kant, these are serious mystifications of St. Thomas' texts, with even more serious consequences for theology. Both these things can be found in the famous Runner's Spirit in the World, his most important philosophical work. So I would like to clarify a little bit the radical difference between the approaches of Aquinas and Kant to human knowledge, so that these confusions may not happen. In my view, we need first of all to understand the problem of the universals, which is the basic problem of human understanding, and in a sense, the only problem in philosophy. Second, we need to understand the stance of both philosophers, Aquinas and Kant, in front of this same problem. Only then we will be able to see what and how radical is the difference between Aquinas and Kant. So, the first point, there's 3 points here, is the problem of the universals. And then we will see what St. Thomas thinks, and then what Kant thinks with their own texts. So first, the problem of the universals. The problem of the universals is basically this. What is it that we predicate of the many? When we say Pluto, Lassie, and Rin Tin Tin are dogs, what is dog? For some, because the many are all different, all dogs are different, and what we predicate of the many is one dog, the universal can be only a name or a concept for them. In other words, the universal is something subjective, a subjective construction that we apply to the many because this is the way we function as human beings. For Aristotle, instead, the universal was something in the things themselves. But in this sense, what we predicate of the many is the nature. That is that specific perfection which gives to each particular thing its own kind. So when I say Socrates is man, I am not attributing to Socrates simply a name or a concept. I am attributing to Socrates the nature of man, the nature. So Socrates is man. I'm not saying that Socrates has the name of a man. I'm not saying that Socrates is thought as a man. I am saying that Socrates is a man. I am saying that the nature of man belongs to him in reality. He is a man. He has in himself something for which I can say that he is a man. And for St. Thomas, it is not that man is white because I think he is white, but I think man is white because he is white. Whiteness belongs to man and is in man. That is to say, for Aquinas, it is intelligence which depends on reality and not the opposite. It's not that things are in a certain way because we think they are in a... No, we think they are in a certain way because things are in a certain way. That's the point. So, in order to understand Thomistic realism, what we have just said is crucial. Whatever the philosophical difficulties of explaining this might be, for St. Thomas, the object of human understanding is reality itself, and not a construction of the mind. In human knowledge, we encounter reality. Human knowledge is not the production of an idol in the absence of reality. What we know, it is not that we know, when we know, it is not that we know a construction of the mind, but rather the mind, in its own way, in the way it can, the mind embraces, attains the various perfections of reality. I said in the way it can. The mind knows reality through the mediation of a cognitive representation. But its object is reality, not the cognitive representation. Now, how can Aquinas say that the nature we know, which is one for all, belongs to the many? They are precisely many. And each of them realizes differently that nature. Or put in another way, we do not find in reality a universal nature, an abstracted nature, but only material individual things. So, how can we say then that what we know exists in reality? That this universal nature is real. How can I say that? Aquinas' answer is that there is a distinction between the thing we know and the mode of being of that thing. The thing we know is certain in reality, but not with the same mode of being with which we know it. In reality, the nature exists particularized, that is to say, together with particular determinations. In the mind, instead, the nature exists, that same nature exists in a state of abstraction, separated from those material conditions. But what we know and what exists in reality are one and the same thing. That is, the nature of the corporeal thing. Kant's problem is that, unlike Aquinas, Kant cannot separate what we know from its abstracted mode of being. Reality is particular, contingent, and stable, he says. Our science is universal and necessary. Therefore, universality and necessity cannot come from reality, but must be the result of the action of the Spirit on the matter of experience. In other words, if there is in human knowledge a certain universality, stability, and necessity, these characteristics cannot come from the unstable and contingent reality, but from the subject. The unstable reality cannot be the cause of any stability in our knowledge. Why then do Aquinas and Kant differ so radically in their respective accounts of human understanding? Because they depart from different facts. The Kantian fact is the universality of the nature in the mind. In other words, that we have a universal concept in the mind. The Kantian fact is that we possess universal science. The Kantian fact is an event of consciousness, something which happens in the mind. What Kant needs to explain is this fact of consciousness, which is universality. Now, it seems obvious that the universality we find in our minds cannot derive from the particularity and multiplicity of experience. Therefore, for Kant, it is obvious that this universality can derive only from the subject. Universality is explained by means of a subjective function a priori from experience. The Thomistic fact, instead, is that we know the nature of sensible things. That is, that we know something belonging to the things themselves. What St. Thomas needs to explain, therefore, is not that those natures belong to or are attributed to the things themselves, because this is the point of departure. What he needs to explain is instead the abstracted mode of being of that same nature in the mind. Or perhaps better said, how we know those intelligible natures. Both Aquinas and Kant face the problem of the universals. We attribute to the particular a universal essence. We say that Peter is man. For Kant, however, because there is absolutely nothing universal in the particular, if we attribute the universal to the particular, then this must be explained as a subjective function. It is the way we think. For Aquinas, instead, we attribute the universal essence to the particular because it is in the particular. This man is a man precisely because he has the essence of a man. Now, the way the essence of a man is in this man is different from the way his essence is in our minds. The mode of being is different, but the essence is the same. This is what may need to be explained. How does that nature come to me? How do I get it? And how do I get it in this way? And how can I say that that is... But for Aquinas, in order to know something, it is not necessary to know it with the same mode of being it has in reality. It is enough to know it. The same thing. Aquinas and Kant depart from two different facts, which imply two different notions of knowledge. For Kant, to know is to have a representation in the mind. To explain knowledge is to find the source of that representation, or, as he says, the conditions of possibility, properly speaking. For Aquinas, to know is to engage reality. To explain knowledge is to find out how this is possible. Kant departs from the unity of the subject with his representation and tries to find out in what sense that representation has something to do with the other, with the outside world. Kant departs from an object which is immanent. Aquinas departs from the unity of the subject with the other of the world. In other words, for Aquinas, there are two poles from the beginning. Knowledge is not the possession of a subjective representation, but the possession of the other as other. What Aquinas needs to find out is how this is possible. For Aquinas, to know is to know something other than the subject. That is why Aquinas needs to explain. For Aquinas, to know is to know something other than the subject. For Kant, to know is to know a representation, something belonging to the subject. That is why Aquinas needs to explain the unity of subject and object. And Kant, instead, needs to explain their distinction. That is, Aquinas tries to explain the subjectivity of the object, of the other. So how the object other becomes one, in a sense, with the subject. Kant needs instead to explain the objectivity of the subjective representation. That is, how the subjective form is applied to the world of experience. This is the radical difference between Aquinas and Kant. So let us try to see Kant's and Aquinas' radically different approaches in their own words. And I leave you with that for the next video. In the previous video, we were trying to show in what the point of the radical difference between Aquinas and Kant in their approach to human understanding. And what is left to us in this second part of the video is to see in their own texts the approach to the problem of the universals, both in Aquinas and in Kant. And we begin with a text from St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, question 84, article 1. I wish you had that article in front of you. In this article, the question is whether the soul knows the corporeal things by means of intelligence, and the point is located precisely in the problem of the universals. Having considered those who denied the possibility of a scientific knowledge of reality because of the instability of reality, and here St. Thomas is considering Heraclitus. Then having considered also Plato, who put stability outside the apparent reality, in a true world of reality, his ideas, the Platonic ideas, and having shown the inconvenience of Plato's solution, Aquinas will go to the root of the problem. So first, those who denied stability. Second, Plato, who put stability outside the world we see. And Aquinas shows that what Plato is saying doesn't make any sense, but then he wants to go to the root of the problem, which is what is interesting to us. I quote Aquinas. Now, it seems that Plato strayed from the truth because, having observed that all knowledge takes place through some kind of similitude, he thought, Plato, that the form of the thing known must of necessity be in the knower in the same manner it is in the thing known. This is the main problem for Aquinas, in the form of a general principle, and the following is an explanation of Plato's error in the intellectual realm. And I quote again Aquinas. Then Plato observed that the form of a thing understood is in the intellect under conditions of universality, immateriality, and necessity, and immobility, which is apparent from the very operation of the intellect, St. Thomas says, who understands in a universal way and with a certain necessity. For the mode of action corresponds to the mode of the agent's form. Wherefore, Plato concludes that the things which we understand must have in themselves an existence under the same conditions of immateriality and immobility. So here we can already see the Thomistic distinction between the object understood and the mode of being of the object understood, which is the point that Aquinas wants to make. St. Thomas will proceed by showing the inconsistency of Plato's principle, and he tries to make it more clear by using an interesting progression. In his first step, St. Thomas considers the sensible realm in its objectivity. I quote, "But there is no necessity for this." That is to say, no necessity for what? Plato has found the nature in our mind in a state of necessity, universality. And because of that, he thought that the reality represented by those universal ideas must be also universal and necessary. And that's why he projected the ideas. And why? Because knowledge is by similarity. That's the point. The similarity of the known, what we know, to the object, he thought, so that the object and object should correspond in the mode of being. Universal here, universal out there. That's the point. And St. Thomas says, but there is no necessity for this. For even in sensible things, he says, it is to be observed that the form is otherwise in one sensible than in another. For instance, whiteness may be of great intensity in one and of a less intensity in another. In one, we find whiteness with sweetness. In another, without sweetness. Unquote. That is to say, the real accidental quality whiteness, being the same in every white thing, can subsist in different modes in different white things. St. Thomas is trying to show in this first step how easy it is for us to conceive that one and the same quality may exist in different modes. The second step is already in the gnosiological realm. I quote, "In the same way, the sensible form is conditioned differently in the thing which is external to the soul and in the senses which receive the forms of sensible things without receiving the matter, such as the color of gold without receiving gold." Unquote. It seems that the main reason St. Thomas uses the senses as an example here is the ease with which one can accept that when we see the color, we receive the color not as it subsists in reality, with the gold included in the example, but we receive the color in another way. We receive the color of the gold, but in another way, without the gold. And that's what St. Thomas wants. St. Thomas thus opens the ways to the solution. So also, he says, the intellect, according to its own mode, receives under conditions of immateriality and immobility the species of material and mobile bodies. For the received is in the receiver according to the mode of the receiver. We must conclude, therefore, that through the intellect, the soul knows bodies by a knowledge which is immaterial, universal, and necessary. So, unquote, it should be clear that the species, Aquinas is talking about, that the species can be called material insofar as they subsist in the matter, not as if they were nothing other than matter. The whole argument would be pointless. St. Thomas is highlighting precisely that even if the form we know, does not subsist in the same way in the intellect as it does in reality, this fact does not prevent the intellect from knowing that same form. St. Thomas is implying here that the stability denied by Heraclitus regarding corporeal things, and the stability projected by Plato in a parallel world, the world of ideas, that stability is actually embedded in the material things as their form or species, but not in the immaterial way in which it is known. This can be seen in many other texts, especially the answer to the third objection. The third objection maintained that because the intellect refers only to necessary and immobile things, and the bodies are contingent and mobile, the intellect could therefore not know the bodies. And St. Thomas answers to this objection, quote, "Every movement implies something immobile, because when a change in quality happens, the substance remains immobile. And when a change in the substantial form happens, there remains the matter immobile. And because of this, St. Thomas says, nothing prevents us from having an immobile science of mobile things." Unquote. So the reason for St. Thomas that we can have an immobile science of mobile things is that there is something immobile in things. Another text from the disputed Questions on the Soul can help us here. What we know, the nature, exists really in reality in the things themselves, even if it does not exist with the same mode of being. And I quote the text. According to Aristotle, says St. Thomas, the fact that the intellect understands a one in many, a universal, in abstraction from individuating principles, this fact is to be attributed to the intellect itself. And though nothing abstract exists in reality, the intellect is not void of any real content, nor is it misrepresentative of things as they are. Because, he says, and this is the reason, of those things which necessarily exist together, one can be truly understood or named without another being understood or named. So he's implying that if two things existed together, we could think or understand about one of them without understanding the other. if they existed together. But it cannot be truly understood or said of things existing together, he clarifies, that one exists without the other. So in other words, if the nature of the dog exists together with individual determinations of the dog, I could understand one, the nature, without the other, the individual determinations. But I could never say that one, the nature, exists actually without the other. As if the nature of a dog could exist without the individual determinations. And Aquinas then explains, thus, whatever exists in an individual which pertains to the nature of its species, and in respect of which it is like other things, can be known and spoken of truly without taking into consideration its individuating principles, which distinguish it from all other individuals of the same species. Very interesting. So St. Thomas is implying that the two exist together. Of course, not separate spatially, in the space, as if in one part of the dog it was the nature and in another part of the dog there is the individuating principle. It's not that. But they are not the same. Because according to one, the dog is similar to other dogs. And according to the other principle, the dog is different from the other dogs. Okay? So it's St. Thomas who is implying that. So St. Thomas is saying clearly that the nature of a dog, which is what makes this dog similar to other dogs, exists in the dog together, not confused, together with that which makes this dog different from others. That nature is what we know in our universal concept. And for that reason, St. Thomas says that what we know is the reality, is reality itself, is a real content, something which exists in reality. Okay. In the words of Fabro, what we know is immanent to in the things themselves, and this is the difference between Plato and Aristotle. I quote Fabro now. Aristotle, applying himself decisively to the consideration of being as being, found in the realities complementary the essence and its concrete determinations, the knowledge of the intelligible and that of the sensible characteristics. Because the form, Fabro says, the form is not separate, but immanent to matter. Certainly, science is always of the universal. The real reality, however, that is, the one which is ascertained by us, is the singular as concrete ousia substance. To it, to the singular, first of all, pertains the character of reality. And the universal can be called real only inasmuch as it is recognized as immanent in the concrete. Is the way Fabro puts it. So the real reality certainly is the concrete, but not because the universal is not immanent, but precisely because of that. Okay, therefore, because it is a fact that we know the nature of corporeal things, and it is also a fact that those natures are not abstract in reality, there must be a difference between the mode of being of those natures in reality and the mode of being that they have in our concepts. There is no difference regarding the content. The content, that which we know, is the same. The difference regards the mode of being. The nature subsists in reality together with individual determinations, and in the mind, abstracted from those material conditions. Plato erred because he did not distinguish, and Kant erred in the same way. So now, let's go to the text from Immanuel Kant, from the Critique of Pure Reason, the first 6 paragraphs of the second edition of the Critique, the first 6 paragraphs of the introduction to the second edition. So, in my view, from this text, we could take the root of Kant's approach to human understanding. They are actually his first words when he's undertaking his critique. Kant says, quote, "Experience teaches us to be sure that something is constituted thus and so, but not that it could not be otherwise." This is what experience teaches us, he says. "Experience never gives its judgments true or strict, but only assumed and comparative universality. So properly, it must be said, as far as we have yet perceived, there is no exception to this or that rule. Thus, if a judgment is thought in strict universality, that is to say, in such a way that no exception at all is allowed to be possible, then this judgment is not derived from experience, but is rather valid absolutely a priori." Very interesting. So in other words, that which is universal for Kant cannot come from experience, because experience is of the particular. Therefore, it must come from the subject in some way. It is crucial to note that Kant's assessment comes from a consideration of the contents precisely as contents of human knowing. That is why he says, "For it could well be," quote, "for it could well be that even our experiential cognition is a composite of that which we receive through impressions and that which our own cognitive faculty, merely prompted by sensible impressions, provides out of itself." Unquote. Kant is analyzing the content of cognition and trying to identify the source of those contents as such, so as thought, taking for granted that it could be possible that not all content comes from experience. What may or may not come from experience is something that is already in cognition. So, we were saying that Kant is analyzing the content of cognition and trying to identify the source of those contents as such, taking for granted that it could be possible that not all content comes from experience. So, what may or may not come from experience is something that is already in cognition. The point of departure for his analysis of knowledge, of the content, the point of departure for him is an analysis of the content insofar as it is in the knower. This analysis of the content insofar as it is in cognition leads him to reject experience as the source of the intelligible content. So the incompatibility which Kant sees between particular and universal implies that he is considering the universal with the mode of being which it has in the subject. And of course, the abstracted universal as abstracted can have nothing to do with experience. This universal is immutable, whereas reality is changeable. The universal is necessary, not contingent as reality is. So this heterogeneity of contents, that is, this difference in kind in the contents of cognition, sensible and intelligible content, is that which requires for him a subjective origin for the intelligible content of human understanding. Okay. Note again how for Kant, at the crucial moment where epistemology begins, the intelligible content is not distinguished from its mode of being. For Kant, the intelligible content is an event of consciousness. It is the idea as subjective representation. The Kantian fact is the subjective possession of a universal representation. That is, the Kantian fact is the knowledge of the universal as abstracted, not the knowledge of the nature of the sensible thing. That is why he says, quote, "If a judgment is thought in strict universality, then it is not derived from experience, but is rather valid absolutely a priori." So the Kantian fact is that the judgment as thought is necessary, not that its truth belongs to experience. So much so that the very fact that it is universal is enough for him to conclude that this judgment does not come from experience. Another way to see it is this. He does not question the universality and necessity of the judgment, but rather denies that anything like universality or necessity could come from experience. In other words, universality and necessity are qualities of the thought, and not of experience. Experience is so foreign to these qualities that they need to be explained a priori. Reality is just sensible. If anything in reality is intelligible, it comes from my intelligence. That's his way of thinking. So it seems clear then that the difference between the approaches of Kant and Aquinas is radical. And the reason also seems clear. They begin from different cognitive facts, and as a result, the respective explanation regarding the facts are different. Kant's explanation views what is a priori, the categories, as the source of intelligible content. The categories make intelligible, give intelligibility and necessity to that which is not intelligible or necessary at all. For Aquinas instead, what is a priori, that is the agent intellect, is the source of the intelligible mode of being of the content. The agent intellect also makes intelligible, but in the sense that it gives intelligibility as mode of being to something intelligible in the thing itself, to the nature which is already in the thing itself. So it makes intelligible the nature which is something already in the thing itself and in a sense intelligible, not in its mode of being, but insofar as it can be understood. There is something in the thing itself, the specific perfection of this thing, that can be understood. Right? And this is what we know. For Aquinas, the intelligible content is a posteriori. It comes from the things themselves. And why? Because it is in the things themselves. Instead, for Kant, who did not differentiate the content from the mode of being of the content, the intelligible content could never be a posteriori. As you may see, one of the dangers of Kant's approach is that because reality doesn't have anything stable of its own, natural law can have an origin only in the subject. And this is the birth of relativism. Another huge consequence is that if all intelligibility comes from the subject, then being, which is the first intelligible, is also explained through a function of thinking. Being is being intelligible. Being is being thought. Now God, who is said to be the absolute being, also becomes a function of human thinking. And so, a God made in the image of human beings. All this for Kant, no? For Kant. God is found in human being as the infinite horizon of human thinking or of human desires. The God of modern philosophy is a God defined by human possibilities, a human infinity, which has nothing to do with the real God. Thomistic gnoseology is challenging because it explains reality as it is, and reality is mysterious. St. Thomas did not escape the mystery, but faced it. St. Thomas did not wish to stay in the plains of doubt, where uncertainty and denial of truth give human beings all kinds of excuses to creep on their bellies like the rest of animals. St. Thomas climbed the mountain, and arriving to the top, realized that we also had wings to fly towards God. It is only through the hard path of study and virtue that we are able to enjoy who we really are. It is easy to stay on the plain, but at the top of the mountain is God. And because it was hard to climb, God Himself descended to the plain to help us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and gave us power to become children of God. May He always help us to find the truth.